Hi, my name is Bill Dwelly, and we're going to be taking a look at creating a controllable drool system for a dog. I'm working with a scene file here, a dog head built by a colleague of mine, Guillermo Carvalho. Alright, so let's jump into it. Alright, now as you can see, I've got a little bit of stuff set up here. I've got a couple of path curves that I'm going to have my drool run along. I've got a profile curve here. So basically what I want to do is I want to use end cloth for the basic structure of my drool. I'm going to use end particles for the bits of actual drool that come off of the end of the drop of drool that tends to hang down from dogs' mouths. Alright, so now if we take a look at this curve, my path curve here, you can see the parameterization on this curve is it's a little wonky. It goes from 0 to 5.773. The parameterization is pretty even. These are chord length curves, but you know, this value 0 to 5.773, that's going to be very awkward to work with, and the other curve is 0 to 6.9. So you know, I don't want to deal with that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rebuild these curves. Rebuild curve. Alright, so first thing is the parameter range. I want to be 0 to 1. I'm going to use the parameterization of the surface that I'm going to extrude from this curve to drive the position of my end particles. And having a nice normalized parameter range from 0 to 1 is just going to make that a lot easier to work with. And the number of spans, I want this surface to deform very freely, so I'm going to give it a pretty high number of spans there. Alright, so I'll rebuild that. So now we can see 40 spans, 0 to 1 parameterization. I'm going to do that for the other curve as well. Alright, cool. So now I've got two curves that are in good shape for me to work with. Alright, so first thing I'm going to extrude a profile curve along my rebuilt path curve. So surface, the extrude option is pretty straightforward. I'm just going with the flat method. I'm extruding, or I'm going to be doing polygons, quads, general method. Because the number of spans of my curve is so high, I don't really need to worry about increasing that with the output geometry. So there's my first surface. You can see it. And I'm going to do that again for the second curve. There we go. And now these two curves, I can even hide them. Alright, so now I've got my two surfaces here. Alright, now there's a couple things I'm going to do first, but eventually I'm going to be emitting particles from, well, not exactly these surfaces, but surfaces similar to these. Because I want this to look like a thin droplet, I want my particles emitted in a very thin stream. Right now, my particles will be emitted all along the surface, which I don't want. Now, if this was more of a slobbering dog, like a rabid dog, or if I had like blood gushing out of this, then I would go with wider surfaces. I'd be more careful with their orientation, but I would keep them wide, and then I'd have a much more, flowing, frothy slobber coming out of the dog's mouth. But in this case, I just want a very narrow stream, so I'm going to narrow my surfaces. Now, the nice thing about having history in mind is if I select my profile curve and I scale it down, let's say I scale it quite small, there's my surfaces. You can see my two surfaces are now very, very narrow. So that's going to be pretty cool. Alright. Great. Okay. So, yeah, so now I'm going to make these cloth objects. So I'll select this surface and switch over to End Dynamics. Create End Cloth. Do the same thing for this surface. So I now have two cloth objects, cloth 1, cloth 2. Nice thing about this, again, having that history, it's a little hard to see them, so if I come back here, and let's say I increase the scale of my profile curve, well, my cloth objects are still here. My cloth objects still pick up that history, so I can see what's happening a little better. So that's nice to be able to go back and forth like that. Cool. All right, now let's see. As you can see, I've set up some collision geometry for my dog. I don't need the entire dog to collide with this geometry, so I've just got a couple of pieces here. That'll just make it easier for to deal with the simulation. So I'm going to select my collision teeth. You can see in my hierarchy here I've got the dog geo render, and then I've got the dog collision or geo collision geometry. So I've got the teeth, the dragon head. So I'm just going to turn each of these surfaces into passive colliders. So passive collider, passive collider. Alright, great. So now if I run the simulation again, geometry hits, slides off. Okay, we're getting there. Okay, that's not too bad. Now, let's see. As I'm refining this, now I'm going to get things a little closer to the way I want it. I'm going to go back and I'm going to make my end cloth surfaces nice and narrow, like I actually want them to be. So there they are. Alright, so that's not looking too bad. Alright, so now, since this is going to be a drop or a couple of drops of drool hanging from the dog's mouth, I want these cloth objects to hang on. Easiest way to do that is with a couple of locators that I've got right in here. I'm going to use those as anchors for the end cloth. Okay, so, but before I do that, I want these surfaces to conform to the shape of the collision geometry. Right now, obviously, they're not conforming to that shape at all. If I advance a few frames, you can see that it will conform to that, and that's holding pretty tightly based on the collision thickness of my geometry. But before I do that, I'm actually going to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to select each of my collision objects, and let's turn on collision thickness and do the same thing for this guy. Collision thickness. Alright, so let's do the teeth first. So for the teeth, I can see that the thickness is 0.041. I'm going to double that. The reason I'm doubling it is just because it's easy to remember doubling it. I'm going to do the same thing for this guy. So that will be 0.092. Alright, so I've just doubled the thickness of my collision objects. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set the initial state for my cloth object. Alright, so let's just advance a few frames. Now I'm just doing it frame by frame. Oh, actually, you know what? I skipped a step here. I'm going to go to my nucleus, and before anything else, I'm going to increase my substeps from 3 to 9. It just forces Maya to do more calculations per frame. You just tend to get nicer, more accurate results. Alright, so I select both these guys, and now I'm just going to go frame by frame. And I can start to see my cloth objects conforming to the shape. Not quite there yet. And that looks pretty good. Alright, now that's pretty good. Alright, so with these guys basically conforming to the shape of just the collision object here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set their initial state. So, end solver, initial state, set from current. So now if I rewind, these guys stay there. Okay, that's great. But I'm not quite done yet. Also, I'm going to turn off the collision solver here, just because it's a little hard to see things. Off. Okay, great. Oh, and also, I'm going to put the thickness back down. on both of these guys. I just turned it up when I was setting this up. Just setting these guys up. Just to make things a little easier. That should be good. Alright, cool. So now the next thing is I want to be able to, anchor the end of these cloth objects to these locators. So let me select Drill Anchor 1. And then right mouse button click vertices and shift select a bunch of verts there. Generally with this I just select the number of verts that I don't want to actually deform or react to simulation. So that should be good. Anywhere beyond here I want this actually behaving dynamically. So I'll apply a transform constraint to that. See, those guys are constrained. I'm going to do the same thing over here with Drill Anchor 2. Apply or select some more verts. That looks pretty good. Transform constraint. So now I've got two dynamic constraints there. Pick these guys. Again, if I hit play, there we go. That's the behavior that I want. That's looking pretty good. Alright. Now, a couple little things. Lots of little things with this. The stickiness from my collision object here. I'm going to turn it up from 0 to 0.5. I'm going to do that for all these guys. Because one of the things I noticed with dog drool, looking at videos of dogs drooling, is that drool sticks to stuff. No question about that. So yeah, nice thing about this is, as my dog is moving its head around, if this drool sort of comes right up under the chin, it might stick there for a minute. It's one really nice thing about end dynamics in Maya. Also, another thing with these two surfaces, because they both have stickiness, if they collide with each other, they'll stick to each other. And because I'm going to have a single particle object emitted from both of these strands, as the particles flow down and into each other, they'll form a single strand coming off, which is very cool. And again, tends to be what happens with dogs. Alright, so now, obviously I don't want my drool hanging or sticking straight out the side of the dog's mouth, so I need to, set the initial state in a more natural condition. I could hit play again and then set the initial state, or another tool for that is if I go to NSolver, if I select my two cloth objects, NSolver, initial state, and just relax initial state. I've set it to 500 steps here. That just means that Maya will run 500 calculations. Nice thing about this is it's not actually going through time. So if you have other animation in the scene, you don't have to worry about it here. Maya is strictly running the dynamic simulation on the selected dynamic objects. So it'll go through the 500 steps, and at the end of those 500 steps, it will set the initial state at however my end cloth objects are. Alright, there we go. That's not too bad. So now, deselect everything, reselect these guys just so we can see them a little better, hit play, there we are. Nice, they're just sitting there the way I want them to. Cool. Now, if we look at dog, you can see that there is animation on Y rotate, so it's good that I was running the initial state that way. So let's take a look at that. There we go. So I just play this now. There we go, there's my drool. Not very exciting right now, but when the dog turns its head, it's a little animation on this dog, we'll see the drool flopping around underneath its chin. There we go. Now, since this is a dynamic simulation, one of the things obviously we're going to have to do is, see we had a little bit of sticking there underneath the chin, is we have to make some adjustments to the different parameters for our dynamic objects. I find that the default end cloth actually isn't too bad for our purposes here, but it certainly can use some adjustment. Make just a couple of little adjustments here. So for my first piece here, extruded surface 1, I'm going to turn the stretch resistance down from 20. I'm going to change that to 5. I'm going to do the same thing for the other guy as well, because I want this drool to have a lot more bounce to it. Dog drool tends to be very elastic, so I'm going to turn that down to 5. That should be good. And let's see, what else? Dynamic settings, turn that down to 5. Yeah, let's leave that for now. You can always adjust these as we go. Okay, cool. So that's pretty good. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is meant to be a very controllable system. One of the things that can be very challenging with dynamics is, building a system that you can easily control. I want to be able to control this, without pulling my hair out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a locator. Just move it up here for now. Its position in space doesn't really matter, just so long as I can get to it. So there it is, and I'm going to call this drool control, and I'm going to use this to control, the basic parameters or the basic behavior of my my cloth here. Okay, now the first thing I want to be able to do is I want to control the sort of the elasticity, or the length, I should say, of my cloth objects here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of custom attributes to this. Modify, add attribute, and I'm going to call the first attribute stretch 1. Copy that so I can paste it later. I want the default value here to be 1. I'm not going to bother putting a minimum or a maximum value in, and it's a float attribute, so we'll add that. And I want to have a stretch 2. Add that. So now we can see, alright, now I've got a stretch, oh shoot, I didn't set the default value for stretch 2. Okay, well, that's fine, that'll work fine. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the stretch adders on my drool control to the rest scale of my cloth object. So if I select my cloth object, and let's see, dynamic properties, and where is it? Rest scale length. So I want to connect the drool control's stretch to my rest scale length. So let me select drool control, window, general editor, connection editor, or you could connect it with a little mouse script. So there's stretch 1, and now select cloth 1. Make sure I have the shape node selected. Reload right. Go down. Usually with these guys, it can be a little tricky finding them, but there it is. So stretch 1, I connect to rest length scale. Now there are attributes with similar names like rest length scale map, stuff like that. You got to make sure you select the precisely correct attribute. Getting it almost correct is no good. Alright, so I've hooked up that for my first cloth object, and now let's do the second cloth object. So I've selected the shape node of my second cloth object, and I will select or connect stretch 2 to the rest length scale of that guy. There we go, we see it's connected. Alright, so nice thing about this is now I can animate the rest scale length of my cloth object very easily. So let's do that. So here we are at frame 1. I'm just going to set a key for both of these guys at 1. And alright, so I'm just going to middle mouse button advance to frame 24. And for stretch 1, I'm going to bring that down to 0.65. I'm going to do these guys separately just so that they're not the same. Set a key on that. Now I'll go to frame 30. and stretch 2 I will set to 0.86. Obviously, when you're doing this, you're going to set these to whatever you think looks nice. And right now, I'm just putting some values down. You'll put whatever values you think look nice, and then you'll adjust them after the fact. All right, so let's go to frame 72, stretch 1. I'm going to elongate it 1.1. These values tend to be, you want to be careful with this. All right, let's go to frame 96. Yeah, you want to be careful with this. That all of this stuff tends to be kind of delicate. So, yeah, be careful. Don't set hugely different values right after each other. All right, so I've got some animation there. If we look in the graph editor, window animation editor, graph editor. So there we can see, yeah, I've got a nice offset to those curves. If I wanted to, I could cycle that. For now, I think I'll just leave it the way it is. All right. So now, if we play, we see some nice behavior there. That's nice. Now, the first time you run this, you might notice a little erraticness in your end cloth object. Second time around, it should be much better. So there we go. So that's not looking too bad. And again, if I scaled those changing values, we'd see the cloth object scaling as we did this. For now, I'll leave that. Alright, so that's not looking too bad. So cool, so now I've got my, my basic cloth set up, and from here on I can start adding the particle systems. But I'm going to stop this video right here and save this file as Drool 2.